The ducks went silent before Ivy Rourke noticed the water had stopped moving. That alone should have told her something was wrong. 41 mismatched ducks, bought secondhand from a farm auction 2 counties over, were never quiet. Not these particular birds with their broken feathers and crooked feet and voices loud enough to carry clean across a flooded orchard on a still morning. One moment, they were working the drowned rose the way they worked every morning, pulling snails off the trunks of half-dead pear trees, stirring the black standing water with orange feet that never seemed to tire. The next moment, every one of them had gone quiet at once, and Ivy, standing knee-deep in the western row with a survey pole in one hand, felt the particular unease of a silence that had no obvious cause. Clementine, the one-eyed hen who limped from an old injury and refused to be separated from the rest of the flock, lifted her head first, turning toward a stand of cattails at the northern edge of the property. Within seconds, the whole flock had turned with her, and then they were moving, not scattered the way they usually fed, but strung out, single file, one behind another, tracing a line beneath the water so straight it looked drawn with a ruler. Ivy watched them pass the red county stake driven into the ground near the fence line, the one stamped in black letters that read, "Unsuitable for agricultural use," the same stake that had stood there since the day the county handed her the deed 11 weeks earlier. The ducks ignored the open water on either side of their path entirely, staying locked to that invisible line, dipping their bills beneath the surface and coming up with pale roots and small snails, and once a piece of gravel that looked nothing like the heavy red clay that made up the rest of the orchard floor. Clementine went under longer than the others. When she surfaced, something gray and flat hung from her bill. Ivy waded over and took it from her, gently, the way she'd learned over 11 weeks to take things from ducks who'd rather keep whatever they found. It wasn't gravel. It was a piece of cut stone, its edge squared off by human hands, a shallow groove worn or carved across its face. She pushed the survey pole into the mud where Clementine had been diving. 8 inches down, it struck something solid. She moved 4 feet forward along the same line and tried again. Solid again. A third time, further still, the same result, whatever lay beneath the flooded orchard continuing in a line too straight to be anything the land had made on its own. A year later, some of the same people who'd laughed at the tax auction when Ivy raised her hand for $22 would be standing outside her gate asking whether she'd consider selling. But that morning, kneeling in cold water with a piece of worked stone in her palm, Ivy knew only one thing for certain. The ducks weren't wandering through stagnant water looking for whatever they happened to find. They were following something. 3 months before that morning, Ivy Rourke had never owned a single tree in her life. She'd spent most of her 29 years pruning orchards that belonged to other people, carrying ladders through rows her father knew better than the men whose names appeared on the deeds. Desmond Rourke had worked pear orchards across 3 counties in Oregon's Willamette Valley for the better part of 30 years, first as a hired hand, later as a foreman trusted with decisions no owner ever bothered to double-check, because Desmond could tell which tree would split under snow load by the angle of its lowest limb, could smell fire blight in the air 2 days before the first blackened leaf appeared, could tell you standing at the base of a tree everyone else had already written off, whether it had one more season of life left in it or none at all. He had never once owned the ground beneath any of it. When Ivy was 11, the orchard where her father had worked for nearly 2 decades sold to a company that wanted the acreage for something other than pears. The new owners gave every family living in the worker cottages along the southern fence line 5 days to clear out. Ivy remembered her father packing his grafting tools into the same wooden box he'd carried them in for years, remembered the particular stillness in his face as he loaded the truck, remembered the one thing he said as they pulled away from a house that had never, not for one day, actually belonged to them. "We knew every tree in that place better than the man whose name was on the paper," he'd said. Knowing a thing and owning it turned out to be 2 different questions the whole time, and nobody ever bothered telling us which one was going to matter. Ivy carried those words into a county tax auction 18 years later in a courthouse basement in Yamhill County, sitting in the back row with $22 folded into the pocket of her jacket and her father's old grafting knife, the one he'd left her when he passed, resting against her palm the way it had rested there through most of the hard decisions of her adult life. The property came up near the bottom of the list, wedged between an abandoned gravel lot and a strip of land too narrow to build anything on. 11 acres, one collapsed equipment shed, 178 pear trees listed by the county assessor in the same flat voice he used for everything as dead or non-productive. Tax delinquent 9 years running, the assessor read from his clipboard. Seasonal flooding, failed drainage, property is designated unsuitable for agricultural use. The opening bid was $10. Nobody moved. Ivy understood, sitting in that back row, exactly why nobody moved. The county wasn't selling clean title. It was selling only its quitclaim interest, meaning whoever raised their hand would inherit not just the land, but every unpaid drainage assessment, every code violation on the collapsed shed, every liability the previous owners had walked away from rather than deal with. That was the whole reason the bid had opened at $10 and stayed there. A man near the front of the room turned around when he heard the low murmur of the auctioneer repeating the opening figure a second time with no takers. Ellis Bragg ran the largest commercial pear operation left in that end of the valley, 600 acres of clean, well-drained ground that had never once flooded in the 20 years he'd owned it. He smiled at Ivy, the particular smile of a man who already believed he understood exactly what she was thinking before she'd said a word. "Careful," he said, loud enough for the row behind him to hear. "Fish don't pay rent, but they sure do multiply." A few people laughed. Ivy raised her hand. 22. The room went quiet for half a second before the laughter came back, louder this time. Nobody bid against her. By noon, Ivy Rourke held the deed to 11 acres that everyone else in that courthouse believed would cost considerably more to abandon than it was ever worth to own. That same afternoon, a county drainage inspector met her at the rusted front gate, handed over the paperwork without much conversation, and drove a red wooden stake into the ground beside the entrance before he left. Unsuitable for agricultural use, stamped across it in black block letters, the kind of official language that was meant to close a question rather than open one. Ivy stood alone after her truck disappeared down the gravel road. Beyond the fence, dark standing water filled the spaces between rows of trees whose upper branches hung bare and gray against the sky. Dead limbs leaned low over the surface like something too tired to reach any farther than it already had. Then, near the eastern edge of the property, something small caught the light against all that gray. A single green bud, no bigger than her thumbnail, at the tip of a branch that looked, from where she stood, like every other dead branch in the orchard. Have you ever stood somewhere everyone else had already decided was finished and felt the particular, quiet certainty that they'd simply stopped looking one moment too soon? The tree itself did not look alive from any reasonable distance. Its upper canopy was bare, a vertical split ran down one side of the trunk, deep enough to hold standing rainwater. Moss thick across the north-facing bark, a pale ring of fungus circling the base right at the floodline. The county's own inventory listed it as tree number 94, dead, recommended for removal. Ivy set her palm flat against the cold, rough bark and unfolded her father's grafting knife, the same one he'd sharpened every winter of her childhood at their kitchen table, drawing the blade across a wheatstone until it could peel bark without bruising the living wood underneath. "Branches will tell you whatever story's easiest to believe," he used to say, working the blade against the stone in slow, even strokes. "The cambium doesn't lie the way branches do. You want the truth about a tree, you go under the bark, not by what you can see from the ground." She placed the blade against a narrow strip above the waterline and scraped gently, the way he'd taught her. The first thin layer came away brown and brittle. She scraped a second time, deeper. Beneath it, a ribbon of green. Not a bright, healthy green, but living. Unmistakably living. She stopped breathing for a second, checked a different section of the same trunk, and found green there too. The tree was drowning, starved of the air its roots needed, badly damaged in ways that would take real work to fix. But it was not dead, whatever the county's clipboard had decided from a distance that never once required anyone to actually cut into the bark and look. Ivy spent the rest of that first afternoon working her way down the eastern row, checking trunk after trunk with the same careful scrape of the blade. Most were gone entirely, the wood beneath the bark gone gray and dry all the way through, several trunks already rotting hollow from the center outward. But 11 trees out of 178 the county had already condemned still showed green beneath the surface. 11 wasn't enough to call the orchard healthy by any reasonable measure. It was enough to prove that whatever report had condemned this property had stopped looking considerably sooner than it should have. As the light started to fail that first evening, Ivy knelt beside tree 94 and pushed her fingers into the cold mud around its base. The water there felt colder than the water 3 feet away in the open row. She moved her hand left, warmer, back toward the trunk, cold again. Then, faint enough that she almost mistook it for wind moving through bare branches, she heard something. She lowered her head and pressed her ear against the wet bark. Somewhere beneath the mud and the standing water, deep enough that she couldn't have said exactly how far down, came a slow, steady sound. Water moving over something that was not soil. She couldn't afford to find out what it was, not right away. A pump large enough to drain even a single section of 11 flooded acres cost more than Ivy had earned in the past 4 months combined. An excavator rental was out of the question entirely. Even the smallest drainage crew in the valley wanted a deposit up front that she simply didn't have sitting in her bank account. So she started with what she could actually afford, which was a hand-lettered index card pinned to the corkboard at the feed store in town, advertising a mixed flock of 41 ducks from a farm that was closing down for good. Old birds mostly, a few with damaged feathers. One drake walked with a permanent limp. The farm owner wanted them gone before the weekend and would take almost nothing for the whole lot rather than deal with finding buyers one at a time. Ivy paid less for all 41 ducks combined than a mechanic had quoted her 2 weeks earlier just to fix the water pump on her truck. Ellis Bragg happened to be standing near the register when she loaded the last crate into her trailer, and he leaned against the doorframe with the particular ease of a man who already considered the joke finished before he'd said it out loud. $22 ducks for a $22 swamp, he said. Fitting. They eat snails, Ivy said, tightening the rope across the crate. Snails are eating what's left of my trees. Seemed like a fair trade. They also eat money, Ellis said, and walked off, still smiling. Ivy released the flock near the collapsed equipment shed just before sunset that same day. For a few minutes, they stood together in a nervous, uncertain clump. Then one duck waded into the flooded row. Another followed. Within a minute, the whole orchard had filled with splashing and wing beats and the particular indignant noise 41 ducks made when they decided, collectively and without consultation, that this new place was worth investigating. For the first time since Ivy had taken possession of that land, it stopped sounding abandoned. The ducks worked constantly through that first week, searching under floating leaves, pulling snails off drowned trunks, snapping mosquito larvae out of the standing water, trampling down young weeds along the shallow edges before they could take root and spread. Ivy built a rough shelter from salvaged boards and scrap wire in the driest corner she could find, and collected 6 eggs the first week, then 11, then 18. It wasn't much money. It was enough to buy feed, which was more than the property had earned anyone in 9 years. By the second week, fewer snails clung to the bark along the eastern row. The standing water near the duck shelter smelled less sharply sour. Small patches of exposed mud began appearing where the flock's constant movement had stirred away years of settled, rotting leaf mat. The orchard was still flooded. Most of the trees were still dying or already dead, but something about the place had genuinely changed in a way Ivy could feel even before she fully understood why. Every morning, not long after sunrise, the ducks stopped their scattered feeding and turned, as one, toward the eastern row. They crossed the open water in a tight line, passed tree 94, and vanished behind a wall of cattails near the far property boundary. For the first several mornings, Ivy assumed they were simply chasing shade, or some concentration of insects she hadn't noticed. Then she started finding pale, thin-shelled snails scattered near the shelter each evening, a variety she never once saw anywhere else in the flooded rows. On the 9th morning, the flock disappeared behind the cattails and didn't come back out. Ivy waited 10 minutes, then 20. The orchard had gone strangely, completely silent, the particular silence that told her something was different this time, not simply the usual quiet of 41 ducks concentrating on a good patch of feeding ground. She picked up her father's grafting knife out of habit, rather than any clear plan for what it might be useful for, stepped into the cold black water, and followed the path the ducks had already worn into her memory over the past 9 mornings, toward whatever waited behind the cattails. The cattails closed behind Ivy like a curtain drawn shut. Beyond them, the orchard narrowed into a strip of standing water running between 2 rows of collapsed pear trees, the ground sloping so gently that she'd never have noticed the grade at all standing near the front gate. The ducks had noticed. They were gathered in a single, tight line, stretching from tree 94 toward the northern fence line, not circling or feeding at random the way they usually did, but each bird following the one ahead of it, dipping its bill beneath the surface at almost exactly the same spot along that invisible line. Clementine dove and came up with a pale snail clamped in her bill, its shell nearly white, with a thin red stripe spiraling around it, a kind Ivy had never once seen anywhere else on the property. She stepped closer. The water around her left boot felt warmer from the morning sun. One step forward, it turned noticeably colder. She stepped back, warm again, forward, cold. A narrow ribbon of cooler water ran directly through the flooded row, and when she crouched and pushed her fingers beneath the surface along that ribbon, the mud there felt shallow and grainy under her hand, while the ground on either side swallowed her fingers nearly to the wrist in soft black silt. The smell was different too. Most of the flooded orchard carried the heavy, sour odor of drowned leaves and stagnant, oxygen-starved soil. Along this narrow ribbon, the water smelled faintly of wet stone after rain. Ivy returned the following morning with her father's old field notebook, a length of twine, and 6 wooden stakes she'd whittled the night before by lamplight. She marked every spot where the ducks repeatedly dipped their heads, then measured the water temperature at each point with a kitchen thermometer she'd carried out from the shed. The first point ran 4 degrees colder than the flooded ground 3 feet away. The second, 5 degrees. By the 4th marked point, the line running beneath the orchard was unmistakable, cutting straight beneath tree 94 between 2 dead rows, continuing on toward the cattails at the boundary. She drove a stake into each spot and tied the twine between them, straight. Too straight to be anything the land had shaped on its own, the way a natural drainage path would wander and bend with the contours of the ground, rather than holding a single unwavering line for 150 feet. For 3 days, she followed the flock and extended that line further, and every new stake revealed the same pattern: colder water, thinner and grainier mud, pale snails, small pieces of gravel that had nothing in common with the heavy red clay making up the rest of the property. On the 4th afternoon, working with a shovel near the northern fence line, the blades struck stone. Ivy cleared away the mud with her bare hands, and a flat gray slab appeared just beneath the surface, its edge cut square by tools rather than shaped by weather or accident. 6 feet further along, she found a second one, then a third.
Someone had placed these stones deliberately decades earlier. Someone who understood this exact piece of ground far better than any county report written from a truck parked outside the fence. Ivy pulled the property survey out of her jacket and unfolded it against a nearby trunk. The official map showed the road, the collapsed shed, the fence lines, a shallow drainage ditch running along the property's outer edge. It showed absolutely nothing beneath the orchard. No channel, no stonework, no explanation whatsoever for cold water tracing a perfectly straight line through 11 acres. The ducks moved on ahead of her without waiting, and Ivy followed until they reached a dense knot of cattails against the northern bank. Clementine began stabbing her bill repeatedly into the mud near an exposed tree root. Something metallic clicked beneath the water.
Ivy pushed the cattails aside and dug with both hands, and her fingers closed around a ring of rusted iron attached to something buried directly beneath the mud. She pulled once. Nothing moved. She pulled again, harder, and felt, through her knees pressed into the wet ground, a hollow sound rather than the dull, solid thud she expected. Not the sound of earth, the sound of empty space beneath stone. It took her the better part of an hour, wedging the shovel beneath the buried edge and leaning her full weight against the handle, before the stone finally gave, rising half an inch before dropping stubbornly back into place. On the third attempt, it lifted enough that a dark ribbon of bubbles escaped from underneath, and a smell rose up with them. Cold mineral water and trapped roots, and the particular deep metallic scent of ground that hadn't touched open air in a very long time. The slab, once she'd cleared enough mud to see it properly, was wider than her shoulders, fitted over a narrow, stone-lined opening built with real care, flat rocks set deliberately along both sides of a channel, rather than simply a ditch scraped through raw soil. The iron ring had once served as a handle, meant for exactly this purpose, meant for someone to be able to lift this exact stone and check on whatever ran beneath it. Ivy wedged the shovel beneath the slab a final time and pushed. The stone tipped, and black water surged into the newly opened channel. For one held breath, nothing else happened. Then the orchard made a sound she hadn't heard in 11 weeks of standing in that same flooded ground, a low, hollow rush moving beneath her knees, followed by the unmistakable clatter of moving water passing over stone. She froze, listening to the sound travel away from her, beneath the flooded rows, toward the far boundary fence. Around her boots, the standing water had begun, slowly at first, to turn. Leaves rotated in small, deliberate circles. Threads of algae stretched visibly toward the newly opened channel. A pale snail slid sideways across the mud and vanished into the current. Ivy pressed her palm flat against the ground beside the stone opening and felt the soil actually tremble beneath her hand. She laughed before she could stop herself, a short, startled sound that sent the nearby ducks scattering briefly before they settled again. The orchard hadn't been sitting on 9 years of dead swamp after all. It had been sitting on a buried circulation system with one blocked artery, forgotten by everyone except the ducks who'd been quietly rediscovering it one snail at a time since the day she'd released them. Over the following 2 days, Ivy located and cleared 3 more access stones along the line the flock had originally shown her, and each time, releasing another pocket of trapped water, the sour surface shifted and fresh ripples spread visibly between the trees. Near tree 94 specifically, the standing water dropped nearly 2 inches within a single afternoon, low enough that Ivy could finally see the swollen, waterlogged base of the trunk and part of the root system beneath it for the first time since she'd bought the property. She set her father's grafting knife down on the exposed stone and rested her hand against it. "You were right," she said quietly, though she genuinely wasn't sure anymore whether she meant her father or the tree itself, or the whole stubborn waiting piece of ground underneath both of them. By sunset that same day, the eastern row looked meaningfully different than it had that morning. Mud ridges broke the surface in places that had been solid black water for weeks. The current pulled rotting leaves steadily toward the newly opened channel.
The ducks fed more aggressively than Ivy had ever seen them feed, following the moving water with an energy that felt, watching them, like a kind of vindication all on its own. Ivy opened a fourth access stone that evening, then a fifth. The flow grew noticeably faster with each one, and she noticed, working in the fading light, a thin crack beginning to spread through the mud around tree 94's base, but told herself, standing there exhausted and thrilled by how much had changed in a single day, that the ground was simply settling as the water level dropped. Moving water meant drainage. Drainage meant air finally reaching roots that had been suffocating for 9 years. Air meant recovery.
She kept working until full darkness erased the fence line entirely. Sometime after midnight, inside the equipment shed where she'd been sleeping on a cot since buying the property, Ivy woke to a sound like a branch snapping under heavy snow. Then another, lower, heavier, coming from somewhere out in the flooded orchard, roots tearing apart beneath the ground. She reached tree 94 just before sunrise and found it leaning toward the water, only a few inches off from where it had stood the evening before, but the soil around its base had split open in a dark crescent, and one of the larger roots lay exposed above the mud like something broken. Ivy stepped closer, and the ground gave way slightly beneath her boot. She caught the trunk with both hands, as though her own weight alone might hold 400 pounds of waterlogged pear tree upright. Somewhere below, water continued rushing through the channel she'd opened too fast, too carelessly, without ever once asking whether the ground beneath these particular trees could handle losing that much support all at once. Another root snapped, and she felt the sound travel up through the trunk into her own arms. "No," she said, to no one, to nothing that could actually hear her. She ran rope from the shed and tied the tree to its nearest still-standing neighbor, drove 2 salvaged posts into the ground, and braced the lower trunk with boards. For almost an hour the ropes held, then the eastern bank gave way entirely, water pouring into the channel and carrying loose soil out from beneath the root plate along with it. Tree 94 tilted slowly, almost gently, right up until the moment the ropes pulled taut and one of the posts tore completely free from the softened ground. The tree came down across the flooded row, its branches striking the water with a sound considerably louder than Ivy had braced herself for. The ducks scattered toward the cattails in a burst of panicked wing beats. Ivy stood in the mud afterward, staring at the small green bud that had first drawn her attention to this tree 11 weeks earlier, now resting only inches above the black surface of the water she'd released too fast and too carelessly. She'd believed finding the buried channel meant she understood this land. What she'd actually done was mistake movement for recovery, and hadn't stopped to learn the difference before it cost her something real. By mid-morning, Ellis Bragg's truck had pulled up to the front gate. He didn't come inside. He stood beside the red county stake and lifted his phone, filming the fallen tree from where he stood. "You draining it or drowning it twice?" Ivy said nothing. By that afternoon, the short video had reached most of the county. The caption someone had added read simply, "$22 orchard falls apart." At the feed store the following morning, according to what Ivy heard secondhand from the one neighbor still willing to speak to her directly about it, people had replayed the clip of the tree falling more than once, and somebody had joked that the ducks had apparently found the fastest possible way to finish killing what was left of the place. Ivy didn't go into town for 3 days. She closed 2 of the access stones entirely and packed straw into the fastest-moving section of the channel to slow the current, and the water level did steady somewhat, but the damage to tree 94 and to her own standing in a county that had already been skeptical of her before this was already done. That evening, sitting alone in the shed with her father's grafting knife resting on the plank table in front of her, she could see the red county stake through the open door, "Unsuitable for agricultural use." For the first time since she'd bought the property, those words didn't feel like an insult aimed at land she'd already proven had more life in it than anyone believed. They felt instead like a warning she was arrogant enough to ignore.
She was still sitting there, considering, not for the first time that week, whether selling the ducks and walking away with less debt than she'd accumulate by staying might genuinely be the wiser choice, when she heard a branch scrape against the outside wall of the shed, the fallen tree shifting slightly in the evening wind. Ivy stepped outside and crossed the flooded row one final time that night. Most of tree 94 was lost beyond any real saving, the trunk split near its base, several major roots torn completely free. But one upper branch she found still showed green when she scraped it. She couldn't save the tree. Ivy opened her father's knife anyway, cut 3 young shoots from that single surviving branch, each no longer than her own hand, wrapped them carefully in a damp cloth, and tucked them inside her jacket. As she turned back toward the shed, headlights swept across the gate. An older woman climbed down from a mud-splattered truck, looked first at the fallen tree, then at the careful way Ivy was holding the wrapped cloth against her chest. "Did you open the drain, or did you just empty the whole orchard out at once?" "I saw the video," the woman said, before Ivy had managed to answer her first question. "I'm Beatrice Yoder. I recognized those square access stones the second Ellis's clip showed the fallen tree behind you. I helped clear that exact line of channel when I was 19 years old, working for the county water board back when the county still bothered maintaining things like that." "For 34 years," Beatrice explained, walking with Ivy back toward tree 94 in the fading evening light, she'd maintained irrigation ditches, culverts, and drainage gates across that whole stretch of the valley, most of which had quietly vanished from any modern county record long before she'd finally retired 8 years earlier. She crouched beside the exposed, torn roots and studied them for a long moment before speaking again. "You opened how many sections? In how many days?" "5, Ivy said. "In 2. Beatrice pressed 2 fingers into the torn bank, feeling the texture of the disturbed soil. "You found part of a system," she said, "and then you treated it like it was the whole system, all at once, without ever stopping to ask what the difference might cost you." "The orchard was drowning." "Yes," Beatrice agreed, "but drowning and simply being wet aren't the same condition, and they don't call for the same response." She picked up a fallen branch and drew a straight line through the mud between them. "A drain carries away water the ground genuinely can't hold." She drew a shallow curve above it. "A ridge slows runoff down before it ever reaches the trees in the first place." Finally, she marked a series of shallow depressions further downhill. "And low basins hold just enough moisture back to keep the ground alive through the dry months, so the whole system doesn't simply flush itself dry the moment you open a channel." "Old orchards," she explained, "particularly ones built on ground with a natural flooding tendency, were rarely engineered to stay completely dry. They were engineered to stay balanced, water moving through in a controlled, patient rhythm, rather than draining away all at once." The buried stone channel Ivy had found had never been intended to empty the whole property in a matter of days. It carried away only the specific excess the soil itself couldn't safely absorb, while the low ridges elsewhere protected root crowns from exactly this kind of sudden collapse. And the shallow basins stored moisture the trees would otherwise lose too fast. When decades of unmanaged silt and unchecked roots had blocked the system's original outlet, the whole orchard had slowly turned into something closer to a sealed bowl. When Ivy had opened several covers at once, she'd pulled not just water, but the supporting soil itself out from beneath the trees faster than their root systems could adjust. "I killed it," Ivy said. "You made a mistake," Beatrice said. "There's a real difference, even if it doesn't feel that way standing here looking at what's left of that particular tree." "It was alive before I touched it." Beatrice glanced at the damp cloth still visible inside Ivy's jacket. "And so are whatever cuttings you saved from it, unless I'm mistaken about what you're holding on to so carefully." Ivy unfolded the cloth. The 3 shoots she'd cut from tree 94's one surviving branch were still green. Beatrice led her to a young rootstock growing near the edge of the eastern row, its trunk barely thicker than Ivy's own wrist, but showing healthy living cambium beneath a small test scrape in the bark. She didn't take the grafting knife from Ivy's hand, she simply pointed at the stem. "Cut above a bud. Keep both surfaces clean. What matters is matching the living layers underneath, not lining up the bark on the outside, which is the part most beginners get backward. Ivy's first cut went too deep. Again, Beatrice said, without any particular sympathy in her tone, and Ivy trimmed the damaged edge, shaped one of the 3 shoots, fitted it carefully into a shallow notch cut into the rootstock, wrapped the union with cloth tape, and sealed the whole thing with wax. The finished graft looked, to Ivy's eye, impossibly fragile. Beatrice studied it closely and finally nodded. "Now you wait." "Waiting is what nearly ruined this whole place," Ivy said. "No," Beatrice agreed. "Neglect ruined it, over 9 years, long before you ever bought it. Waiting while actually paying attention is an entirely different thing than simply letting something sit forgotten."
Beatrice looked off toward the road running along the northern property line. There used to be a main outlet for this whole system, somewhere near that boundary, larger than the section you opened up. If that section's blocked the way I suspect it is, that would explain nearly everything, from the original flooding straight through to how fast things went wrong once you started clearing individual sections without understanding how they all connected downstream. Do you know exactly where it is? Not exactly, Beatrice admitted, and for the first time since she'd arrived, she sounded genuinely uncertain about something. But I might know where an old maintenance record from that period got stored, assuming it hasn't been thrown out in the meantime. She returned the following morning carrying a water-stained sheet of paper sealed inside a plastic sleeve, one corner missing entirely, several of the original pencil markings faded nearly past reading. But across the northern edge of what was unmistakably Ivy's own property, a second stone channel had been sketched in fading blue pencil, a channel that didn't appear anywhere on the modern county drainage map. "This came out of an old valley maintenance ledger," Beatrice said, tapping the faded line with one finger. "The outlet should begin somewhere inside your western boundary and run beneath the county road from there." To inspect that section properly, Ivy would need formal county approval, since it crossed beneath a public road. On the truck radio, driving the 2 of them into town 2 mornings later, a weather advisory crackled through describing a slow-moving storm system building over the coastal range, expected to reach the valley within 5 days. At the county drainage office, a tired-looking clerk compared Beatrice's old hand-drawn sketch against the current official drainage map pinned behind his desk. He turned the faded sketch sideways, then held it up beneath the fluorescent light for a long moment. "There's no registered channel shown here," he said finally. Ivy set her photographs on the counter between them, the flat-cut stones, the rusted iron ring, the exposed section of channel beneath the orchard floor. "It's there," she said. "I've stood in it." "I'm not saying you didn't find something real out there. You're looking at pictures of it right now." He glanced back toward the office behind him, where a wall-sized county drainage map showed blue lines threading across farms and roads and culverts throughout the entire valley. None of them entered Ivy's property at all. "We can only act on what's officially documented in the current system," he said. Ivy unfolded Beatrice's old sketch and laid it directly beside the modern map. The faded blue pencil line ran beneath the county road and toward a culvert that, according to Beatrice, was now half buried under decades of overgrown brush. This was documented, just not by anyone who bothered updating your current system after this valley started forgetting what it used to know about its own ground. "We can only act on what's officially documented in the current system. Your system says my property doesn't have a drain at all. I'm telling you it does, and I'm telling you it's failing right now, and a storm coming in 5 days that's going to test whatever's left of it, whether your paperwork agrees that it exists or not." The clerk looked more tired than hostile, which somehow made the refusal land harder rather than easier. "If you disturb anything underneath county road property without formal approval, you'll be personally liable for any road damage, flooding, or downstream loss that results, regardless of your intentions." "How long does approval actually take? Survey? Engineering review? Environmental inspection?" He paused. "Realistically, several months, start to finish." Ivy stared at him. 5 days of margin against several months of process wasn't a gap that closed itself, no matter how reasonable her evidence was. The clerk slid her photographs back across the counter. "I'm sorry," he said, and seemed, at least, to genuinely mean it. Outside, On the courthouse steps, rain had already begun tapping lightly against the concrete. Beatrice was waiting beside her truck. "They said no," Ivy told her. "They said the map was final," Beatrice said. Ivy looked toward the dark clouds already gathering over the northern hills. "Is it?" Beatrice opened her truck door without answering directly. "Paper stays final right up until water disagrees with it." Ivy didn't touch the county's own culvert. Instead, she went back to the orchard and spent the next 4 days rebuilding the system she'd nearly destroyed, one small, careful section at a time, exactly the way Beatrice walked her through it. She closed 2 access stones completely and narrowed the others with flat rock rather than leaving them fully open. She packed the eroded banks with woven willow branches and straw. She reshaped the collapsed soil near Tree 94's ruined base into low ridges designed to slow runoff rather than simply funnel it straight toward the channel the way she'd done before. Along the highest, most exposed strips of ground, she scattered rye and clover seed the way Beatrice suggested, to hold the loosened soil in place through whatever the coming storm brought with it. For 4 straight days, Ivy worked from first light until full dark. She marked the water level on every trunk with chalk, checked the fragile new graft from Tree 94 each morning, still green, still holding, and by the evening before the storm was due to arrive, the orchard looked less like a flooded field slowly falling apart and more like a genuine system, patiently waiting to be tested properly for the first time in 9 years. Then, just before sunset that final evening, Clementine lifted her head, and one by one, the rest of the flock stopped feeding entirely. They didn't turn toward the channel Ivy had spent 4 days carefully restoring. They turned west instead, crossing the whole orchard together toward a mound of tangled roots near the county road, a spot with warmer water, deeper mud, and no visible stonework anywhere beneath the surface. Clementine dove once, then again. On the 3rd dive, she surfaced with a strip of rotted wood clamped in her bill. Beneath the gathered flock, the water had begun unmistakably to pulse. It didn't ripple the way wind or a passing fish would cause it. It rose beneath the ducks, then dropped, slow and deliberate, as though something buried below the mud were breathing hard against a throat that had been blocked for far too long. Ivy pushed the survey pole into the mud beside the spot where Clementine had just surfaced. It sank nearly 2 feet before striking something solid. She moved 6 inches closer to the road and tried again. Solid there too. The line pointed directly toward the county's own culvert, but the actual blockage itself sat a full 12 feet inside her own fence line, well before the channel ever crossed beneath the road at all. She could clear what sat on her own land without touching a single inch of county property. Rain had already started by the time she reached the shed for a shovel, rope, and a lantern, Beatrice's old sketch still sealed against her chest beneath her jacket. Not heavy yet, just a cold scattering across the standing water, each drop opening a brief silver ring before it vanished into the next one. Beatrice arrived 20 minutes later, her headlights cutting a path through the cattails. "You called about the ducks," she said, climbing down from the truck. Ivy pointed toward the pulsing water. Beatrice watched it rise and fall twice in silence before she spoke again. "That's not standing water. That's something trying to move and failing to." They dug by hand since the tangled roots were too dense for a full shovel stroke, Ivy cutting away the dead fibers while Beatrice cleared mud with a narrow trenching spade. The rain strengthened steadily as they worked, soaking through Ivy's jacket, running cold down both sleeves. Beneath the roots, they found a collapsed timber frame, and below that, stone, the opening beneath it wider than the eastern channel, nearly 3 feet across, built like a covered throat running directly beneath the orchard floor. "The main outlet," Beatrice said quietly, "should have carried away everything the rest of the system couldn't hold, straight through to the road culvert. Instead, it's packed solid. Decades of compressed leaves, rusted wire, broken glass, a fence post someone had driven directly into the opening years earlier, either to mark the spot or to deliberately seal it off from something Ivy couldn't guess at. Ivy wrapped rope around the buried post. Beatrice caught her wrist before she could pull.
"Not all at once," she said. "Not this time." Thunder rolled somewhere out over the valley. Months earlier, Ivy understood. She would have simply hauled on that rope until something gave way entirely, the same reckless certainty that had cost her tree 94 in the first place. Instead, she cut the smaller roots first, cleared away the loosest leaf mat, opened a gap no wider than 2 fingers, and waited. A thin stream escaped from the narrow gap. Ivy checked the chalk mark on the nearest trunk. The water had dropped less than a quarter inch. She widened the opening slightly and waited again. The current strengthened, but the bank held firm this time. For the next 2 hours, she repeated the same careful rhythm, over and over, in the strengthening rain. Clear a little more, watch closely, measure the change, stop before pushing further. The storm arrived in full force well after dark, rain hammering hard against bare branches, water pouring off the road and filling the shallow ridges Ivy had spent 4 days rebuilding. The ridges slowed it. The eastern channel carried part of the runoff away to the north, but the flooded rows kept rising steadily anyway. At the main outlet, the old fence post remained stubbornly wedged beneath the largest stone. Ivy braced both boots in the mud and pulled hard on the rope. The post shifted an inch. A dark surge of water pressed through the widening gap. Beatrice lifted the lantern higher. Again, slowly. Ivy pulled once more and the post finally tore free. For one violent second, mud and water burst out through the opening all at once, and Ivy fell backward into the flooded row, bracing herself for the same kind of collapse that had cost her tree 94 3 weeks earlier. But the willow bracing held this time. The channel didn't roar the way she'd feared. It drew, steadily, water folding into the stone opening in one broad, controlled current. Leaves turned in slow circles. Foam stretched into pale, even lines across the surface. The pulsing that had gathered beneath the ducts disappeared entirely. Ivy checked the chalk mark on the nearest trunk, waited. 10 minutes later, the water had dropped half an inch. After 30 minutes, a full inch. By the time dawn broke over the valley, the orchard had genuinely begun to reappear. First, the tops of the earthen ridges she'd rebuilt. Then narrow strips of dark, exposed soil that hadn't seen open daylight in 9 full years. The ducks approached the newly exposed ground cautiously at first, Clementine setting one orange foot down, then the other, testing it. For the first time since Ivy had brought them to this property, the whole flock walked between the pear trees instead of swimming through them. Ivy stood there in the last of the rain and laughed, the same startled sound as before. The land wasn't dry yet. The orchard was nowhere close to fully saved, but the water was finally moving where something, decades earlier, had deliberately built it to go.
The orchard didn't recover all at once. For the first week afterward, the clearest change was simply the smell, the heavy sour odor that had clung to the eastern rows for years, slowly starting to fade. The mud still held plenty of water, but it no longer released bubbles the way it once had whenever Ivy stepped across it. Beneath the surface, air was finally returning to roots that had been suffocating for nearly a decade. Then the shoots started appearing, small red points pushing up from exposed rootstock, first along the western row, then near the collapsed shed, then beneath trees the county had marked dead years before Ivy had ever set foot on the property. She counted 14 the first morning she noticed them. 2 days later, there were 39. By the end of that first month, she'd simply stopped counting altogether. She cut away dead wood, protected the new living shoots, and grafted pear varieties onto the strongest of the surviving rootstock, every single cut made with her father's old knife, every graft wrapped carefully by her own hand. The ducks worked steadily through the rows behind her, eating snails off the trunks, hunting larvae in the softening soil, trampling down young weeds before they could establish. Ivy moved the flock section by section now, the way Beatrice had taught her, never leaving them anywhere long enough to churn the ground back into the same kind of liquid mess she'd started with. The graft taken from tree 94's last surviving branch remained, through all of it, the most fragile thing on the entire property. For weeks, the sealed buds stayed closed.
Ivy checked it every single morning, pressing one finger lightly against the wrapped union, watching for softness, for rot, for any sign the two living layers had failed to properly join. Nothing changed, until one cold morning in early spring, when she finally found the wax split cleanly by a thin line of green, a single leaf unfolding. Ivy stood beside it for a long time that morning, saying nothing at all. By May, the shoot had grown nearly a foot. By June, 3 pale blossoms opened along its stem, the very first flowers anywhere in the restored orchard, growing directly out of the same tree Ivy had, through her own carelessness, killed only months earlier. That autumn, a state agricultural extension specialist walked the whole property alongside Beatrice, testing soil samples, inspecting the restored stone channels, studying the surviving root systems section by section. These trees were never actually dead below ground, he told Ivy, standing near tree 94's replacement graft. The drainage failure hid what was still viable the entire time. Whoever assessed this property originally simply never looked past the surface. The county, notified of the findings, quietly updated its own records. The red stake at the front gate stayed exactly where it had always stood. Ivy left it there. 3 weeks later, Ellis Bragg's truck pulled up to the same gate. He didn't laugh this time. He walked slowly along the fence line, studying the young grafts, the cleared rows, the ducks moving steadily through new clover. "Heard you're selling trees now," he said. "A few," Ivy said. He nodded towards the orchard behind her. "I might be interested in buying more than just the trees." Ivy said nothing at first. Ellis named a figure, more money than she'd ever seen attached to her own name in one place. For a moment, standing at that same gate, she thought back to the courthouse basement, the laughter, the $22 folded into her jacket pocket. Then she looked past him towards the graft from tree 94, 3 small pears now hanging beneath the branch that had once rested only inches above black standing water. "It's not for sale," she said. Ellis removed his cap, was quiet for a moment, then asked whether he might be allowed to see the drainage system for himself.
Ivy opened the gate. "You can," she said. "Clean the mud off your boots first, though, before you walk anywhere near the grafting rows." He looked down at his own boots, said nothing further in argument, and scraped them clean before stepping through. The first pear from tree 94's graft ripened in late August, small and slightly uneven, a faint russet scar marking one side of its skin. Ivy left it hanging 3 extra days past when it was actually ready, not because the fruit needed the time, because she did. On the 4th morning, she walked into the eastern row with her father's grafting knife in her pocket, the orchard quiet except for insects working the clover and the soft, steady clicking of duckbills against damp soil. Water moved beneath the restored stone channels, steady now, nearly invisible from the surface. At the gate, the red county stake still stood exactly where the inspector had driven it 11 months earlier, unsuitable for agricultural use. The paint had faded considerably since then. The words underneath had not. People had asked her, more than once by that point, why she'd never simply pulled it out of the ground. She never gave quite the same answer twice. Sometimes she said it marked the entrance clearly enough for delivery trucks. Sometimes she said it kept her from getting too confident about what any single report, hers included, could actually claim to know for certain. The truth was simpler than either answer. The stake reminded her, every single time she walked past it, that a judgment could be entirely accurate about one particular moment and still be completely wrong about everything that moment turned out to still be capable of becoming. Ivy stopped beneath the young graft and opened her father's knife. The hinge gave the same quiet squeak it had made the very first day she'd scraped bark from tree 94, back when the whole orchard had still been nothing but black standing water and a county's certainty that there was nothing left worth looking for underneath it. She lifted the ripe pear in one hand and cut the stem clean. Her father had spent 30 years caring for trees rooted in a ground that never once belonged to him,
learning every weakness and every hidden strength a tree could carry, never once granted any real say in what eventually happened to any of it. Ivy stood in an orchard that belonged to no one's report now, that belonged instead to the work itself, to the roots that had survived 9 years of neglect and 1 careless season of her own making, to water finally moving where someone, decades before she was even born, had deliberately built it to go. The ducks hadn't performed any kind of miracle. They'd simply followed cooler water and living insects and a faint current running beneath years of settled mud. Ivy had been the one who finally noticed, and the one who'd nearly ruined everything trying to rush toward an answer she hadn't yet earned the patience to use carefully. What she'd found beneath that flooded ground wasn't treasure, not in any way people liked to imagine treasure working. It was stonework, living rootstock, a system someone had built with real care and then forgotten, because nobody left behind had ever bothered looking closely enough to notice it was still quietly trying to do its job, waiting for someone patient enough to let it.